What if I told you that the woman who spent years publicly destroying Whitney Houston's reputation was fighting the exact same addiction Whitney was? What if the cruelest voice in American media was not speaking from a place of moral superiority, but from a place of desperate, terrified recognition? What if everything you thought you knew about one of the most infamous feuds in entertainment history was built on a lie? Not a lie of malice, but a lie of survival. Because here is the truth that nobody talked about when it happened, and almost nobody is talking about now. Wendy Williams did not target Whitney Houston because she hated her. She targeted Whitney Houston because she saw herself. Every symptom she broadcast, every warning she issued, every detail she described with that confident, unflinching smile. She knew those details the way you only know something you have lived through yourself. She was an addict talking about an addict, a woman in recovery narrating someone else's fall, pointing a spotlight outward with both hands so that nobody would ever think to shine it back at her. And then Whitney died. And 2 days later, Wendy Williams sat in that chair, under those lights, in front of those cameras, and she said the truest thing she had ever said in 60 years of living and 30 years of broadcasting. And almost nobody noticed. This is the story of two women, two addictions, one confession, and what it means that the cruelest thing Wendy Williams ever did turned out to be the most human thing about her. Stay with me, because what happened between these two women is not what you think it is. And when you understand what was really going on, it changes everything. She made a career out of other people's pain. For decades, Wendy Williams sat behind a microphone and later a television desk, dissecting the lives of celebrities with a precision that felt less like entertainment and more like surgery without anesthesia. She was merciless. She was fearless. She was magnetic in a way that made millions tune in every single day. Not because they admired her, but because they could not look away. But there was one name that came up again and again throughout her career. One woman whose story she returned to like a wound she couldn't stop pressing. Whitney Houston. For years, Wendy Williams said things about Whitney that no one else dared to say out loud. She broadcast her demons to the world. She narrated her addiction like a cautionary tale. She turned the slow unraveling of one of the greatest voices in history into daily entertainment content. And she did it with a smile. And then Whitney died. On February 11th, 2012, the world lost Whitney Houston. And something inside Wendy Williams, something she had buried under years of bravado and broadcasting, finally cracked open. What happened next on her show was not planned, not scripted, not part of any publicity strategy. It was something far rarer in the entertainment world. It was the truth. At 61 years old, Wendy Williams is no longer the queen of her own domain. She is a woman fighting guardianship battles, navigating a devastating health diagnosis, and living in the quietest chapter of a life that was never quiet for a single day. The cameras are mostly gone. The audience has moved on. But the confession she made in 2012, the one where she looked into the lens and admitted something she had never admitted before, still stands as the most important thing she ever said on television. Not because it was about Whitney, because it was about herself. This is not simply the story of a rivalry between two women. This is the story of two addicts, two survivors, two women who fought the same war in very different uniforms. One of them became a legend. The other became her loudest critic. And the reason why, when finally spoken aloud, changes everything you thought you knew about both of them. Wendy Joan Williams was born on July 18, 1964, in Asbury Park, New Jersey. A coastal town that carried more mythology than comfort. The kind of place that produced Bruce Springsteen songs, Blue-Collar Dreams, and the particular loneliness of people who felt too big for the world they were born into. Wendy was one of those people from the very beginning. She grew up in Ocean Township, the youngest of 3 children in a household that was stable, educated, and entirely unprepared for what she was. Her father was a teacher. Her mother, a school librarian. Her older siblings were, by most accounts, the children her parents understood. Wendy was the one they spent years trying to figure out. She was loud when silence was expected. She was blunt when tact was required. She asked questions that made adults uncomfortable and said things that other children had been taught to keep inside. She was not cruel. Not yet. She was simply unfiltered in a world that demanded filters, especially from young girls, and especially from young black girls in suburban New Jersey in the 1970s. School was not a refuge. It was a daily reminder that she did not fit. She was tall and large-framed in a culture that rewarded smallness. She was opinionated in classrooms that rewarded compliance. She was fascinated by gossip, by the interior lives of people, by the gap between what others presented publicly and what was really happening behind closed doors. That fascination was not malicious. It was genuine, but it made her strange to her peers. And strange was its own kind of exile. She later recalled those years with a frankness that was itself a form of armor. She said she was never the pretty one, never the popular one, that she survived school. She didn't enjoy it. A simple statement, but the weight inside it is considerable. Survival is a word people use when enjoyment was never an option. What saved her, in the most literal sense, was radio. In her teenage years, Wendy discovered that a voice could be a weapon, a tool, a passport out of invisibility. She was drawn not to music radio, not to the polished formats of mainstream broadcasting, but to the rawness of talk. To personalities who said exactly what they meant and dared audiences to keep listening. She heard in those voices something she recognized. Permission. She studied communications at Northeastern University in Boston, where the distance from home gave her room to become louder, brasher, and more deliberate about the person she was constructing. She was not simply learning broadcasting. She was building an identity, assembling a persona out of every social rejection she had ever absorbed and turning it into a broadcast signal. Her early radio career was turbulent by design. She bounced through stations. She was fired more than once. She consistently pushed content further than program directors wanted to go. She talked about sex, drugs, celebrity secrets, and the private lives of public figures with a directness that terrified management and electrified listeners. She was reprimanded. She was suspended. She was told repeatedly to soften, to moderate, to remember who was actually paying her. She refused by the early 1990s. Wendy Williams had found her home at WDAS in Philadelphia, and later at Hot 97 in New York, where her morning show became one of the most listened to programs in the city. Her audience was loyal in the way audiences are only loyal to personalities who make them feel like they are hearing something forbidden. She was not a journalist. She was not a commentator. She was something harder to categorize and far more dangerous to ignore. She called herself the queen of all media before Howard Stern had fully claimed the king title. She said out loud what tabloids only hinted at. She named names. She connected dots. And she did it all with a laugh that made cruelty sound like a public service. But behind the microphone, something else was happening. What very few people knew, what Wendy had buried beneath the performance of absolute confidence, was that she was fighting an addiction that had wrapped itself around her life long before fame made her a household name. Cocaine. The drug that exists at the intersection of ambition and desperation. The one that tells you that you are not just functioning, but invincible, until the moment it tells you nothing at all. She has spoken about it since, in fragments, in careful disclosures, in the kind of confessions that come out sideways rather than all at once. She started using during her radio years, in the world of late nights and green rooms, and the particular loneliness of being the loudest person in every room while feeling completely hollow when the microphone went off. The addiction was not a secret to everyone. Industry insiders whispered. People close to her saw the signs. But in the world of shock radio, erratic behavior was often indistinguishable from brand identity. The line between Wendy performing and Wendy unraveling was deliberately blurred, and she worked hard to keep it that way. What made her dangerous as a broadcaster was the same thing that made her vulnerable as a human being. She had no off switch. The same compulsive honesty that made her radio show essential made her incapable of the kind of self-protection that might have slowed the addiction before it took hold. She was always broadcasting, always on, always transmitting, even when what she was transmitting was pain she hadn't yet named. And in this, though neither of them knew it, she and Whitney Houston had already begun to occupy the same territory. Whitney was recording her first album in 1985, the year Wendy was getting her first real radio foothold. They were operating in different galaxies of fame. Whitney was ascending into a kind of stardom that only comes along once or twice in a generation. The kind where your voice alone is enough to make a room go still. Wendy was building an audience out of the people that mainstream media ignored. The ones who wanted the truth behind the gloss, the gossip behind the gospel. They would not collide publicly for years. But the collision, when it came, would be spectacular. And ugly. And in retrospect, entirely inevitable. Because Wendy Williams was drawn to Whitney Houston the way certain people are drawn to a mirror they both need and cannot stand to look at. By the late 1990s, Wendy was at the peak of her radio power. She had survived firings, feuds, and industry pressure that would have silenced a less stubborn personality. She had also quietly, and with enormous difficulty, begun the process of confronting her addiction. She entered treatment. She relapsed. She entered again. The war was private and prolonged and nowhere near finished. It was during this specific window, when Wendy herself was most raw and most frightened about what the drugs were doing to her life, that she began to talk about Whitney Houston on air. And she did not say kind things. She discussed Whitney's rumored drug use openly before it was confirmed, before it was reported in major publications, before anyone with a mainstream platform would touch it. She named the specific substances. She described what people around Whitney allegedly witnessed. She was relentless. She was graphic. And she was, in the purely clinical sense of the word, accurate. The entertainment industry was appalled. Whitney's camp was furious. Bobby Brown issued statements. Lawyers were involved. Radio stations received pressure to pull Wendy off the air. And the story of Wendy Williams versus Whitney Houston became one of the defining media feuds of the era. A battle between the sacred and the profane. Between the woman the world had placed on a pedestal and the woman who refused to pretend the pedestal was solid. What nobody said out loud, what nobody knew to say, was this. Wendy Williams was not narrating Whitney Houston's addiction from the outside. She was narrating it from the inside. Every detail she broadcast about Whitney's struggle, every symptom she described, every warning she issued to an audience that treated it as entertainment, she knew because she had lived some version of it herself. She was not exposing a stranger. She was, in some fractured and unexamined way, describing herself. That truth would not emerge for years. It would require Whitney's death to pull it into the open. By 2003, Wendy Williams had become something the entertainment industry had never quite produced before. She was the person who said the thing everyone else was thinking, but had the institutional sense to leave unspoken. Her radio show in New York had made her a genuine cultural force. And that year, she did something that would define her public identity for the next 2 decades. She sat across from Bobby Brown in a radio interview, and she went to work. Bobby Brown was at that point one of the most discussed figures in American entertainment. Not for his music, but for his marriage to Whitney Houston, which tabloids had transformed into a national obsession. Wendy did not approach the interview with caution. Caution was not her instrument. She pushed. She probed. She asked the questions that no mainstream outlet would touch. She created a space in which Bobby Brown said things that reverberated far beyond that studio. The interview became a cultural event. It painted a portrait of Whitney Houston that was unflattering in the extreme. A portrait of addiction, dysfunction, and a marriage that appeared to be consuming both people inside it. Whitney's team was incensed. Wendy received threats. She received legal warnings. She received the kind of industry pressure that signals to most broadcasters that a line has been crossed. Former colleagues distanced themselves. Stations received calls. The message from multiple directions was identical. You have gone too far this time. Wendy did not retreat. She doubled down, continued the coverage, continued the commentary. And in doing so, she cemented a reputation that would outlast the radio era entirely. What she was not publicly was vulnerable. That was the performance. And that was the architecture she had spent 20 years constructing and reinforcing and defending against every attempt to dismantle it. The Wendy Williams the world saw in 2003 was a woman in absolute command. Loud, certain, untouchable. The Wendy Williams who went home after those broadcasts was a different story entirely. She was still fighting the addiction she had entered treatment for. The recovery was real but fragile, the way early recovery always is. She was managing her radio empire, maintaining a marriage to Kevin Hunter that was already complicated in ways she would not publicly acknowledge for many more years, and carrying the private weight of a sobriety that required daily, deliberate work. She was, in other words, doing exactly what Whitney Houston was doing, fighting, struggling, and performing normalcy over an interior that was anything but normal. This is the fact that reframes everything. When Wendy Williams described Whitney's addiction on air, when she named substances and behaviors and warning signs with a specificity that shocked even jaded industry observers, she was not speaking from a position of moral superiority. She was not the sober observer narrating the fall of someone weaker. She was someone who recognized the symptoms because she had experienced them. She was someone who understood the psychology of denial because she had practiced it. She was, in the most uncomfortable possible interpretation, narrating her own shadow while pointing at someone else's. Whether she understood that at the time is a question only she can answer honestly. What is clear is that the confession she eventually made suggested she understood it, at least in retrospect, with a clarity that was almost unbearable. The television show launched in 2008 and changed the scale of everything. What had been a radio phenomenon became a daily national broadcast, syndicated across the country, reaching audiences that had never heard her radio work. The set was bold. The energy was aggressive. The Hot Topic segment, in which Wendy dissected celebrity news with the efficiency of a forensic examiner, became the reason millions of people arranged their mornings around their televisions. She was magnetic in a way that defied easy explanation. She was not conventionally likable. She did not soften her opinions for the camera the way daytime hosts typically did. She did not perform warmth she didn't feel. She sat in that chair, and she was exactly who she had always been, amplified to a frequency that the whole country could receive. The audience responded with a loyalty that the industry found genuinely surprising. They called themselves the Wendy Watchers. They wore the show's merchandise. They showed up to tapings as if attending something sacred. What they were loyal to, what they tuned in every day to receive, was the specific sensation of hearing someone say the truth without apology. Whitney Houston remained a recurring subject. By 2008, by 2009, by 2010, and 2011, the news around Whitney was difficult to frame as anything other than a slow and painful deterioration. The voice that had once been described as a gift from God was audibly damaged. Public appearances raised concerns, and Wendy covered it, commented on it, discussed it with her audience in the same direct terms she had always used. But underneath, something had shifted. Wendy's own sobriety had deepened. The years of recovery had given her not just distance from the addiction, but a different kind of understanding about it. The kind that comes not from reading about a disease, but from surviving it long enough to see its full architecture. She knew things about what Whitney was experiencing that she could not broadcast. Not because they were secret, but because broadcasting them would have required her to explain how she knew. And she was not ready for that. She was still performing in vulnerability. The show demanded it. The brand demanded it. Then came February 11th, 2012. Whitney Houston was found unresponsive in her hotel room at the Beverly Hilton in Los Angeles, submerged in the bathtub. She was 48 years old. The cause of death would later be determined as accidental drowning, with heart disease and cocaine use as contributing factors. The voice that had sold over 200 million records worldwide was gone. The entertainment industry stopped. Not in the performative way it sometimes stops when a major figure dies. Not the brief pause before the content machine resumes its rotation. It stopped in the way it stops when something genuinely irreplaceable has been lost. When the scale of the absence makes the noise of ordinary business feel grotesque. Wendy Williams went on air 2 days later. February 13th, 2012. The show was already scheduled. The audience was already seated. The cameras were already positioned. And Wendy sat in that chair, under those lights, in front of the live audience she had spent 4 years cultivating. And she did not do what anyone who knew her would have predicted. She did not do hot topics. She did not dissect the circumstances of Whitney's death with clinical efficiency. She did not perform composure. She did not reach for the armor that had served her for so many years in so many difficult moments. She cried. Not the contained, quickly managed tears that television personalities allow themselves when sentiment is required. She cried in the way that people cry when something has broken through every defense they have ever constructed and reached something real underneath. Her voice cracked. She stopped speaking. She started again and stopped again. The audience, which had come expecting the show they always received, watched something they had never seen before and would never see again in quite the same form. And then she said it. She told her audience that she had been harder on Whitney Houston than she had been on almost anyone else in her career. She acknowledged that. She did not minimize it. And then she explained why, in a confession that has never received the attention it deserved. Perhaps because its honesty was so complete that neither the media nor the public quite knew what to do with it. She said that she had been in recovery herself. That the addiction she had covered so relentlessly in Whitney's life was a disease she knew personally. That when she looked at Whitney Houston and described what she saw, she was in some way describing what she had fought to escape. That the famous 2003 interview, the one that had defined their public dynamic and made Wendy synonymous with a particular kind of ruthless exposure, had come from a place she had never fully examined until that moment. She was not excusing herself. She was explaining herself. And there is a difference that matters enormously. The confession did not arrive as a carefully worded statement reviewed by publicists. It arrived the way real confessions arrive, imperfectly mid-sentence, with the ragged quality of something spoken before the speaker has fully decided to speak it. She was not performing contrition. She was experiencing it in real time in front of an audience of millions. She said she saw her own demons in Whitney. That she covered her the way she did because she knew exactly what Whitney was going through. That she never admitted that. That now Whitney was gone. And that the cruelty wasn't cruelty. It was recognition. It was fear. It was her looking at Whitney and seeing what she was terrified of becoming. The audience in that studio did not know how to respond. Some cried. Some sat in silence. The usual energy of the show, the call and response, the laughter, the communal judgment of celebrity behavior, was entirely suspended. Something real was happening, and everyone in the room understood it. The media covered the moment briefly. A few outlets noted that Wendy had been emotional. Some described it as a touching tribute. But the full weight of what she had disclosed, the specific admission that her years of Whitney coverage had been shaped by her own addiction and recovery, did not receive the sustained examination it warranted. It was treated as a moment of grief. What it actually was a reckoning. And reckonings in the entertainment industry have a very short shelf life. The news cycle moved on. The show continued. Wendy returned to the chair, to hot topics, to the daily business of being the most talked about personality in daytime television. The confession was filed away in the archive of things said on television that were true and important and quickly forgotten. But something had changed. Not publicly, not in any way the ratings reflected immediately, but privately, in the way Wendy talked about celebrity struggle, in the frequency with which she returned to themes of addiction and recovery, in the particular softness that occasionally appeared at the edges of her delivery when a story touched the territory she had mapped on that February morning. The years that followed brought their own complications in waves that accelerated rather than slowed. Kevin Hunter, her husband of more than 2 decades, the man who had been her manager and business partner and the central fixed point of her personal life, was revealed in 2019 to have maintained a years-long affair that had produced a child. The marriage that Wendy had defended publicly through years of industry rumors, that she had cited as evidence that the woman behind the television persona was stable and grounded and loved, was exposed as something she had been surviving rather than inhabiting. The divorce was filed. The betrayal was total. And Wendy, who had spent her career narrating the private devastations of other people's lives, was now the subject of the same coverage she had always delivered. The health disclosures began arriving in sequence. Hyperthyroidism, Graves' disease, lymphedema, the chronic condition that caused visible swelling in her legs and significantly restricted her mobility. And then in 2023, the diagnosis that reframed everything that had come before, frontotemporal dementia, a progressive neurological condition that affects personality, behavior, and language. The specific tools that had been Wendy Williams' entire identity and instrument. The woman who had built a career on the precision of language, on the perfectly timed pause, on the ability to read a room and deliver a line that cut exactly where she intended, was facing a disease that attacks precisely those capacities. Frontotemporal dementia does not take memory first the way Alzheimer's does. It takes personality. It takes the mechanisms of social judgment and verbal expression and the ability to be, in the fullest sense of the word, yourself. For Wendy Williams, that is not an abstract loss. It is the most personal one imaginable. The guardianship battle that followed was ugly in the way that legal disputes involving incapacitated people are always ugly. Stripped of dignity. Conducted in public. Argued over the question of who had the right to make decisions for a woman who had spent 60 years making her own with enormous force. Her financial situation, once a symbol of what relentless ambition and fearlessness could build, was reported to be severely compromised. Accounts frozen. Assets disputed. The empire that had generated hundreds of millions in revenue over a decade-long career was suddenly inaccessible to the person it had been built around. The audience that had loved her moved on the way audiences do, to the next voice, the next personality, the next person willing to say the forbidden thing with a smile. And the chair she had occupied was filled by someone else. The industry that had made her indispensable found, as it always does, that no one is actually indispensable. But none of this changes what happened on February 13th, 2012. What happened on that day was the truest thing Wendy Williams ever said on television. And the truest things are rarely the most covered ones. There is a particular kind of truth that only becomes visible from a distance. Not the distance of indifference, not the distance of forgetting, but the distance that comes when enough time has passed and enough has been lost that the original shape of a story finally becomes clear. You cannot always see the architecture of something while you are still inside it. Sometimes you have to lose almost everything before the structure reveals itself. Whitney Houston never knew. And that is one of the facts about this story that resists easy resolution. Whitney Houston died without ever hearing Wendy Williams explain why the coverage had been what it was. She died without the context that might have reframed years of public exposure as something more complicated than cruelty. She died without knowing that the woman who had been her most relentless critic in the media had been all along fighting the same war in a different uniform. Whether that knowledge would have mattered to Whitney is impossible to say. The wounds of public humiliation do not typically soften when their origin is explained. Being exposed is being exposed, regardless of the psychological complexity behind the person holding the light. Whitney felt what she felt. Her family felt what they felt. The explanation that came 2 days after her death could not reach her. But it reaches us. It reaches anyone who has ever watched two people destroy each other and wondered what was really underneath the destruction. It reaches anyone who has ever understood from the inside the specific mechanism by which we attack in others the thing we most fear in ourselves. It reaches anyone who has looked at someone else's visible struggle and felt, beneath the judgment, the cold recognition of a shared terrain. This was never a story about a feud. It was always a story about two women who were given different amounts of grace by the same industry at the same moment in American culture. Whitney Houston was given the grace of being loved first, of being elevated to a level of sacred status that meant her eventual fall would be narrated as tragedy. Wendy Williams was given no such grace. She was the voice from the margins, the one who had survived by being harder than the world she inhabited, the one whose addiction was never a tragic backstory, but a liability to be managed in secret while she performed in vulnerability for a living. The industry did not protect either of them. It consumed Whitney, and it celebrated the consumption. It amplified Wendy, and then discarded her the moment she could no longer deliver the performance at the level it required. Both women were, in the final accounting, content and product. And what made them human was what happened between them in the spaces the industry did not control. Whitney's voice in the quiet of a recording studio before the cameras arrived, before the expectation became unbearable. Wendy's tears on a February morning in 2012 before anyone had told her what she was allowed to feel. The parallels between their lives are not comfortable to examine, but they are real. Both women were daughters who felt the weight of expectation before they fully understood what expectation meant. Both women found in performance a form of survival, a way to translate interior pain into exterior power. Both women encountered addiction in the specific context of an industry that rewards excess and punishes vulnerability. Both women were surrounded by people whose proximity was often transactional. And both women were, beneath the personas that made them famous, more fragile than those personas ever allowed them to appear. Whitney's fragility was eventually exposed against her will, narrated by others, turned into content by the very media machine that had first made her a goddess. Wendy's fragility was self-disclosed, imperfectly, at enormous professional risk, in a moment that the media largely failed to recognize as the most significant thing she ever said in public. One of them is gone. The other is facing a form of loss that is its own kind of ending, slower and more private, but no less complete. And what remains, in the space between those two trajectories, is the confession. What Wendy Williams said on February 13, 2012 was not a eulogy. It was not a tribute in the conventional sense. It was an admission that the years of coverage, the relentless exposure, the famous 2003 interview, the daily commentary, all of it had come from somewhere she had never publicly identified. It came from recognition. It came from fear. It came from the specific psychological mechanism that makes us loudest about the thing we are most desperate to keep invisible in ourselves. She saw her own demons in Whitney Houston. She said so on television, in front of millions of people, with her voice breaking and her composure gone and no script to return to. That is not nothing. In an industry built on performance, in a career built on the premise that weakness is a vulnerability to be exploited rather than a truth to be spoken, that confession cost something real. It did not undo what had been done. It did not repair the years of coverage that had followed Whitney through some of the most painful chapters of her life. It did not give Whitney anything, because Whitney was already gone. But it gave the rest of us something. It gave us the complete picture. The picture in which both women were complicated. Both were damaged in ways their fame never protected them from. Both were fighting battles the public only ever saw the surface of. The picture in which the cruelty was not simply cruelty, but the defensive aggression of someone who recognized in another person the exact vulnerability she could not afford to show in herself. Understanding that does not require forgiving it. Complexity is not the same as absolution. What Wendy did to Whitney's reputation across those years was real. It caused real harm. Harm that Whitney felt, that her family felt, that shaped the public narrative around her in ways she could not control. That harm does not disappear because its origin was psychological rather than purely malicious. But understanding it changes the story. It changes it from a simple narrative about a villain and a victim into something far more human and far more difficult. It becomes a story about two women who were both, in different ways, undone by the same industry that made them. About the specific damage that is done when people are required to perform strength they do not possess. About the way addiction moves through a life and shapes everything it touches, including the things we say about other people's addictions. Wendy Williams at 61 is not the woman she was at 40 or at 35, or at the height of the radio years when she first discovered that a voice could be a weapon. She has been diminished by illness, by betrayal, by the particular kind of loss that comes when the identity you built over decades begins to dissolve. But she is also the woman who said, without preparation and without the safety of a script, that she had been wrong. Not in those exact words, but in the only way that actually matters. In the specific act of looking at the camera and saying, I knew. I knew because I was there too. And I never told the truth about that until now. Whitney Houston gave the world a voice that will outlast everyone who ever spoke either kindly or cruelly about her. Her music is not a relic. It is not a historical artifact. It is still playing. It is still making people stop what they are doing and feel something they had not expected to feel. That is a form of immortality that no amount of tabloid coverage, no years of difficult headlines, and no painful final chapter could diminish. Wendy Williams gave the world something smaller, but no less real. She gave it a moment of honesty so complete that it briefly made the entire apparatus of celebrity media, the gossip and the judgment and the daily commerce of other people's pain, feel as fragile and temporary as it actually is. Two women, two addictions, two very different kinds of fame. And between them, for one unscripted moment on a February morning in 2012, the truest thing that either of their stories ever produced. Not a performance, not content, just the truth. And the truth, even when it arrives too late, even when the person it was owed to can no longer receive it, still matters. Because it is not only for them. It is for everyone watching who recognized something in the space between what Wendy said about Whitney and what Wendy finally admitted about herself. It is for everyone who has ever been the loudest critic of a struggle they were quietly losing. Everyone who has ever pointed at someone else's visible wound to keep attention away from their own. The mirror Wendy refused to look at for so many years was always there. She looked at it on February 13th, 2012. And what she saw in it was not her enemy. It was herself. If this story stayed with you, if you felt something in it that you recognize from your own life or someone you love, share it. Because the people who need to hear this most are probably the ones who will never search for it on their own.